You know, one of the things, good morning, everyone. My name is Tommy Lee, and I get a chance to lead this wonderful organization, Resource Global and the Growth Center, and we get a chance to partner with Pastor Mark and his church. I love the humility of Pastor Mark, and I love how even simple things of just coordinating some of these setups here on Sunday morning is something that I've learned from Mark as well, too. Thank you, James. And, you know, it's my first time meeting James in person. I got a chance to meet Phoebe also in person. Our whole life these days is online. Our whole life is on Zoom and everything like that. So when you get a chance to meet each other in person, it is a joy. I would probably say James is, when we chatted with him, he had graduated from Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, and now he works in the marketplace. And I think all of us in this day and age, this is the world of the modern day pastor, don't you think? And a lot of times there will still be a need of the full-time pastors. There will still be a good chunk of those who are full-time pastoral ministry who went to seminary and are doing that full-time as a vocation. But more and more as I encounter leaders from different parts of the world, they're wearing different hats. They're your bivocational pastor, whether or not their church won't be able to afford them in a full-time salary, so they're doing that, and then from that point on, they're doing a job. Or there are different business leaders out there who are working in the area of finance or accounting or tech, but they love the church. And so they're doing that full-time, and then on the weekends or on the time, they're working. There's this one friend I have, Shundran Thomas. Shundran is the president of Northern Trust Asset Management. Shundran is so successful in the area of private equity. But yet on the weekends, he's an associate pastor of his dad's church. There's another guy, Dr. Nicholas Pierce. He is an MBA, executive MBA professor at Northwestern University. He does a great job in the area of education. But yet on the weekends, he's the associate pastor of his church. We're seeing that more and more as well too. And that's why a lot of times with the Growth Center, I get a chance to partner with Pastor Mark and do all of these wonderful things that you guys are doing. Hey, let me just, before we dive into our sermon today, a couple of things I did want to share with you as well too. Let's bring up the first couple slides here. Next slide here. We are starting a certificate. For me, I spent 10 years building cell towers. That was my job, those big telecommunications tower. That was what I did for 10 years. But during the evening, I went to seminary. And it was 3 grueling years of evening classes. I walked away from seminary realizing that sometimes a seminary is not something that people can afford. It's not even something people can have time for. So what are some of the core classes that you need from some of the key teachers, whether it's Bible, theology, but leadership, culture, justice, integration, faith, and work that you need that allows you to really be able to gain the knowledge and the education that you need. So we've actually created a 9-month cohort program. If some of you guys who are listening or sitting here who are interested, I'll send you more information than Pastor Mark to send over to you once a week for 9 months, and you could decide, hey, I want to do month 1, but I don't want to do month 2. I could do month 4, taught by some practitioners, marketplace leaders. You have people like Shundran Thomas, who I was talking with, Jillian Anderson, who works at Gallup. Her job is working with Southwest Airlines in the area of strength finders. You have Pastor Albert Tate, who does a great job of expository preaching in LA. Andy Crouch, who wrote the wonderful book, Culture, Making, and Power. And he does a great job talking about the role of Christians integrating in culture. Or Dr. Crawford Loritz, who teaches a wonderful class in leadership that he taught over at Trinity, Leadership as an Identity. Another one, next slide as well too, that I want to point out is Mr. Dave Evans. If you have ever never talked to Mr. Dave Evans, he worked for Steve Jobs many years ago, created the mouse for Apple. Now he teaches at Stanford University called Designing Your Life. A wonderful class that is always filled with people as well too, all talking about design thinking, how God uses design thinking to really be able to help you to process the calling in your life. So that is it. I'll send you guys more information. let's hold off on all the slides. Two other things as well, too, is number one, and again, ministry has changed, doesn't it? And so I think a lot of times one of the things I've also been wondering, and I love what Urban Voice is doing with your church, I've been wondering, Mark, how do you plant churches in the meta universe? We've now done it over in Zoom, and we're getting used to it. But around the world with government restrictions, access, whatever it is, Roblox has become one of the most popular platforms in all of the world. I sat down with a private equity analyst who studies all of the Asia markets. And she says, Tommy, you need to look at how ministry interacts with the world of Roblox in the meta world. Because a lot of times, Katy Perry just did a live concert there and had over 3 million people attend. Another individual on Fortnite, Travis Scott, had a live concert there and had 30 million people attend. Another individual over in Bellevue in Seattle or in the Washington area created a youth ministry. He draws 40,000 youth from around the world for this youth ministry. And so as a result, as we begin to look at ministry, what are some of the creative ways, because the traditional church model is decreasing. A lot of the American churches, and I speak mostly from American church, their decline are coming from the younger people who are disengaged or frustrated with where the church is. So a couple of thoughts as well, too. But look, it ties in with our sermon as well, too. All of us are anointed by God to do something unique. All of us are called by God to contribute to this world. How that looks like for each one of us is going to be a little bit different. Today is a part 2 of our sermon called Anointed by God. We're looking at a popular story that all of us, whether you're sitting here or you're sitting at home watching this, is a story of David and Goliath. A story that all of us have always been familiar with. Besides the crucifixion, besides the birth of Jesus, David and Goliath is a story that we've grown up hearing. The story of the little boy with the slingshot who takes on the 9-foot giant in Goliath and wins, and later on becomes the king of Israel. We love that story. It has a great happy ending. But within that story, there are some unique things that God teaches us and how God anoints a young boy. And through that journey, he allows him to have one turning point in his life that changes the course of his life. He is anointed by God. And we talked about part 1 2 months ago. It may seem like an eternity. Part 1 2 months ago. And today we're going to talk about part 2 of Anointed by God. Some of the things, just to refresh your memory of what we talked about part 1, and we'll go into part 2. I talked about 3 things, six insights on being anointed by God. 2 months ago, we talked about the first 3. So let me just review it. Number 1, when God looks at the heart, when God anoints a leader, he looks at the heart of the individual versus the outer appearance. When God anoints a leader, he looks at the heart of the individual versus the outer appearance. And we talked about the story of Saul. If you guys all remember Saul, Saul was a man from Benjamin. Benjamin had a wonderful reputation. Benjamin was the elite of all of the tribes. Benjamin was a very wealthy tribe. That's where Saul came from. And Saul came from an extremely wealthy family, an extremely powerful family, and now he was brought in and selected as king. But sometimes having the outer appearance, right, doesn't qualify you to be king. Having the talents, having the smarts, having the wealth by appearance alone, outer appearance, does not qualify you for leadership. And as a result, through a series of mistakes that Saul makes, disqualifies him for leadership. And so then God sends Samuel, the prophet, over to Bethlehem to meet Jesse and his family. And he says, Jesse, there when you meet this guy, a Bethlehemite by the name of Jesse, you will find your first king. And there Jesse goes, and the story goes, some of you guys, he brings all of his sons. Jesse calls all of his sons, the first 3 oldest boys. And the first one is Eliab. And he looks at Eliab. He is the oldest. He's the strongest of all of the boys. And Samuel says in his ear, surely, that is the king. And God reminds him, says to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. And so Eliab wasn't it. And remember, later on, Eliab becomes very key in the story. And he looks at his second son. That wasn't it as well, too. And he goes for the third son. That wasn't it. And Samuel then says, Jesse, is there anyone else? Oh, I forgot, there's David, the young boy who's out in the shepherd field. Call him. And there Samuel anoints him as the king. Story goes on. Sometime later on, a battle takes place. And a battle takes place in the valley of Elah between the Philistines and the Israelites. One of the things, if you guys remember, that I talked about the differences between the Philistines and the Israelites, and we're going to talk a little bit about why Elah was so important but look, the Philistines were coastal people. The Philistines were sophisticated cultural people. The Philistines learned how to use iron for weapons and tools and maintain monopoly on the market. They were masters at working with iron. And as a result, they had the technology and tools to make them one of the strongest, one of the most elite tribes at that time. They could make shields, they could make swords, they could make spears, they could make armor, everything. Compare that to the Israelites. The Israelites were primitive in comparison. They were not a professional army. They were shepherds and farmers. They had outdated weapons. Probably the only 2 that had even any armors or shields or swords was Saul, their leader, their king, and Jonathan, their son. That's it. So you're having a ragtag bunch of guys who were farmers and shepherds against this group, and the odds were great. Why Elah, as you said? Guys, if you get a chance, take a look at this particular map, and you'll see, next slide, right there. Look at where Gath is. Look at where Azekah is and Soko. That right there is the valley of Elah. If you look at north, what do you see there? It leads to a lot of things. The richness of the Jordanian Valley. Thank you, guys. And the reason why is where Israelite was positioned led to a passageway into the Jordanian Valley into much riches. And so the Philistines had to defeat the Israelites and get rid of them in order to gain access into this passageway. They were standing in their way. And so they brought all of their armies from Gath over to the valley Elah. And this is why they were so weak. They were so weak. The Israelites were so weak. The Philistines are looking at it and says, you know what? They're not worth our time. We're not going to get our guys in a battle and try to fight them. Let's just get it easy. So they called in their big giant Goliath and say, Goliath, we're going to bring you in, and Israelites, bring in your best champion, which was supposed to be Saul, and we're going to have a duel. Whoever wins gets access. If we win, Israelites, we'll go away. But if you lose, you go away and we take over. Easy. So for 40 days, this happens, which leads us to the second point, that you never know when God is calling. Because if the first point that we had is that when God anoints a leader, he looks at the heart of the individual versus the outer appearance. The second point is this one. You never know when God will come calling. Here is David, who just got anointed by God as the next king. Samuel whispers to him, you're going to be the next king. And what happens? Does David then become the next king? No, he goes back to the field. He becomes a shepherd boy, and then Jesse comes calling him and says, hey, come here. I need you to bring food to your brothers. And from that point on, bring these 10 cheeses to the commander and their thousands. Bring some food to your brothers. Make sure they're well. And bring some token from them. You never know when God is calling you to do something amazing in your life. So God looks at the outer appearances, but yet God calls you. We look at the story of Nehemiah. At age 60-something, right? He's a cupbearer to the king. And now he is called because he has a burden to rebuild the walls of Israel. Peter, James, and John are fishermen. God calls them to take up and leave their job as fishermen and to come and follow me. But then we also see Zacchaeus, don't we? Zacchaeus is a tax collector, not just any tax collector, but the chief tax collector. And somehow or another, he encounters Jesus because there's something about his life that he doesn't like to see. And what happens with Zacchaeus? God calls and says, Zacchaeus, I need to spend time in your home. But yet, he doesn't call him into full-time ministry. He doesn't call him just like he calls James and John and Peter to pick up everything and follow. Matthew calls him as a tax collector, pick up everything, follow him. But Zacchaeus is different. Zacchaeus, I need you to go back and become the tax collector again. But I want you to be a better version of the tax collector. You never know when God is calling. You never know what he's calling you to do. And that calling may not sometimes be vocational ministry. Maybe a calling like I was talking with James. Graduate from seminary and now working in the corporate marketplace, but still using his skills as a worship leader, a wonderful worship leader, and in ministry as well too. It all looks differently as well too. For me, I worked 10 years in the corporate world building cell towers. I always thought I was supposed to be a minister. I thought I was supposed to be a pastor. After 3 years, I realized, God, you're not calling me to be a pastor. That is not what I'm called to do. Worked at Moody Bible Institute, a seminary for a number of years under the president. I thought that was it. After 3 years, that ended, and God closed that door. And for the last 12 years, I get a chance to run multiple organizations, not one, but 2, 4, 5 organizations, because I realized God had wired me differently. That the traditional way of doing church was not what my calling was. But I get a chance to work with marketplace leaders. I get a chance to launch new organizations. That's what God was calling to. You never know what God is calling. You're always sitting there looking and seeing and asking God to really work in your life. And the third thing, the anointed leader will be criticized by others. That you won't make everyone happy, and your goal is not to strive to make everyone happy, because we saw the story of Eliab where when he sees David, Eliab, the oldest brother, he sees David and says, why have you come down? With whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? That God's anointed can be criticized because we're never going to meet everyone's expectations. There are things that we do or don't do that's not going to make everyone happy. We're not going to meet the expectations that people have of us. And so God's anointed needs to learn how to, as we talked about, needs to be thick-skinned. You can't take things personally. You have to learn to hear what people have to say, learn to listen to feedback, but you have to be thick-skinned and continue to strive to do what is best to honor the Lord in everything that you do. And there it goes to verse 34. But David said to Saul in verse 34 in 1 Samuel chapter 17, in verse 34, in the story of David and Goliath, David said to Saul, as soon as he volunteers to kill Goliath, Saul says, what in the world are you? Who are you again? You're this tiny little shepherd boy coming to bring cheese to his brothers. But David said to Saul, your servant, in chapter 17, verse 34, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go and the Lord be with you. Which goes to my fourth point. God uses your past to prepare you for the future. God uses your past to prepare you for the future. Why do I say this? Some of us are always in the midst of looking to see what God is doing, what God is calling us to do. We're anxious. Across the board, when I travel, I get a chance to travel to Southeast Asia, Nairobi. I hear the same thing from young leaders, especially those in their mid-20s to their mid-30s. They always say to me, Tommy, I want to know what God is calling me to do. I just want to know what God is calling me to do. And one of the things I've always had to tell them, I said, you got to learn to be patient in this sense. That sometimes God doesn't tell you what to do. Sometimes God leaves you in limbo. Because remember, you are on a journey that he wants you to be. And so as a result, he wants you to learn to be faithful to where he has placed you right now. And he uses that experience to prepare you for something that he wants you to do. I say this, we look at scripture, Nicodemus, right? Nicodemus was in his mid-60s before what? Before God says, I need you to build this wall for Jerusalem. But what was Nicodemus doing this whole time? He was a faithful what? Cupbearer to the king. He served the king faithfully. He did his job well. He was a great employee. And when he finally got that burden to rebuild the wall, what happens? His boss, the king, who Nicodemus served faithfully well, was his first and only donor, funded his entire project, gave him the vacation days and the time off to go and do his job. Because what? He was a great employee. When I graduated from Washington University in St. Louis, I graduated with a business degree. And there I was looking for a job, and I got hired in my job, and it was a company by the name of American Tower, and they built cell towers for a living. And I thought, great, I come from a Ivy League school, Washington University in St. Louis. What is my job? Am I going to oversee a team? Am I going to oversee projects? Tell me what it is. They said, yes, your first job. You see all those files that we just got? Verizon Wireless, at that point in time, we acquired 200 towers and all of their documents, all of their files in one room, unorganized construction drawings, all of this random drawings. You see that? Organize that room. What? I just graduated from university. I graduated with a management degree. You want me to do what? Lord, what are you calling me to do? What can I learn from this? So I said, Lord, if you have put me in here, I'm going to do the best job I could possibly do. And I organized that file room pretty well. But more so, I learned how to be organized. I learned the discipline of spotting and creating structures that I never learned before, day in and day out. For over 6 months, I did that. And so after I did that, my boss said to me, you did great. Now I need you to do something different. I need you to create a system to scan everything. Really? I got to scan everything? Back then we had scanners and we had to take hard copies and sit there and scan it. And so I did that for another 4 months. What was God? I look back now, it's 12 years later. God used that time in my life to create me a discipline to be organized. He helped me to spot how to create patterns, how to organize different things, how to organize different projects, how to really be able to use Excel, all of that. To this day, I still use that. One of the things that people tell me all the time is, Tommy, you organize your team so well and you are able to keep in line everything. How do you manage so many different projects? And I think back to all those months of being in a file room, learning grudgingly and saying, Lord, if you've placed me, or how can I be faithful to where you have placed me in my life? You never know. We sit there and we grumble. We're above this. No. Where's God placed you? How can we be faithful? How do we continue to be a good witness, to honor and faithful to where he has placed us in whatever job? Because you may be sitting here right now watching this, you're saying, I can't stand my job. I can't stand my boss. I hate everything that I'm doing. What is God teaching you? Why does he have you right there? Why is that so important during this first time? What is he showing you? God uses your past to prepare you in the future. One little thing, I get a chance to work with young leaders around the world, especially Indonesia. I love Indonesia. I get a chance to work with these young leaders who are now starting businesses, and they're growing in massive, not only wealth, but power that will influence their city. They're running family businesses and what they call unicorn companies that are growing big. And I get a chance and the honor of serving and working alongside with them to integrate their faith in everything that they do. But you know why I'm doing that so well, or I've gotten a chance to work? Because I sat in a church in Chinatown, Chicago for 18 years, working with youth in high school and college. And I learned how to work with them because during those 18 years in that private, with those 100, 200 students that came in and out every single year, I learned what it meant to be a leader. I learned what it meant to work with developing leaders, working with younger leaders, what it meant to work with volunteers, what it meant to plan games, what it meant to plan events, to sit there and plan. All of those things led me to what I am doing now. You never know. You never know. God has powerful plans, and here's my encouragement for those who are watching. God has powerful plans in your life, but he may not have revealed it to you right now. So are you faithful to where he has placed you at that moment? Because God uses your past to prepare you for the future. Second thing is in 1 Samuel 17, 38 through 40. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor. He tried it. And he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So he put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Let me show you another picture. Let's show the last slide over there, what that sling looked like, that slingshot. Right there, that's what the slingshot is look at. Couple things. Ironically, Saul chooses to give David his armor and sword and everything like that. Here's why. Let me read to you Judges chapter 20, verses 15 through 17. Judges 20, 15 through 17. The people of Benjamin, remember which tribe Saul was in. The people of Benjamin mustered out of their cities on that day 26,000 men who drew the sword, besides the inhabitants of Gibeah, who mustered 700 chosen men. Among all those were 700 chosen men from Benjamin who were left-handed. Every one could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. The tribe of Benjamin were experts at the slingshot. Ironic, isn't it? That Saul, where is he from? The tribe of what? Benjamin. The very tribe who knew how to use a slingshot. They used it in battle. They were skilled marksmen with the slingshot. He gives David a sword and a shield, armor, all of that. David puts on him. Does it work? Lesson here is this. What works for others may not necessarily work for you. What advice people give you, what they tell you to do may not necessarily work for you. And does that mean as leaders, we sit there and we don't listen because, hey, we're going to do it our way? No, you listen. One of the best qualities about leadership is you're listening to people. You're always trying to improve yourself. You're always trying to be the best version that God calls you to be. But in the midst of that, always knowing that sometimes the answers that they give you, it may not work for you. That's not how it works. Let me give you an example. My mother is trained in Hong Kong or as a teacher, and she has a very, very stern way of teaching. Growing up, we always had to get straight A's. And she had a chopstick on her finger that if we got a math problem wrong, that chopstick went on her finger. If we got a spelling word wrong, we had to sit there and write it out 100 times. Well, and she's always reminding us, you have to get straight A's, education, and all that you do. Well, now I have a daughter, and she's 7 years old. Well, she goes to my mom's school over here in Bridgeport, here in Chicago. My mom takes her way, because that's her way of doing education that she believes is work on, straight A's, and she tries to use this on my daughter. Not to say it doesn't work, but I keep telling my mom all the time, you have to understand that getting straight A's is not always the end all. Just studying without interaction is not always the end all. But in her mind, no, this is the best. You have to study all the time. To the point, my daughter doesn't like going to her house anymore. Because my mom is at the same school. She picks her up and she sits there and she makes her study from 3 o'clock all the way to 5. And then when she wants her to go to her house on Sundays to do homework, what do you think is going to happen with my daughter? She cries every single time she has to go to her grandmother's house because she doesn't want to go. And I keep telling my mom, maybe you need to lighten up. No, you need to make them study all the time. It's going to look different, folks. What works for them may not necessarily work for you. And so as a leader, hear from people. Listen to what people have to say. But you got to figure out, is it going to work for me? Is it going to work for me? In all of the leadership that you have. As a leader, that those who are anointed by God, you're going to hear advice from problems. You're going to hear solutions to the problems that you deal with all of the time. And some of them, listen to it. Some of them, will it work? Probably not. You got to figure out that decisions. But as leaders, on the other flip chart, if you have a team, don't insist that your way works. Don't insist that your way works. What works for others may not work for you. Your job as a leader, for God's anointed, God has given you people to shepherd, to help them find their voice, to help them learn how to think. I work for one ministry leader, and Caucasian guy, older guy, his way was always the best. His style was always the best. You couldn't make the decision unless you do it, run it by him for him to give you the okay. That way worked for him, probably for a period of time. Doesn't work for everyone. What works for others may not necessarily work for you. And the last one I want to look at is the battle goes on. David takes a slingshot from afar. He defeats Goliath. And David said to the Philistine right before that, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, 9-foot-tall Goliath. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. God uses your past to prepare you for the future. What works for others may not work for you. We have to understand that. And thirdly, the Lord's anointed is concerned about upholding the glory of God and honoring God, and he or she goes out before the Lord in everything they do. You are a steward of who God is. You are a steward of God, what God is calling you to be. Your life is no longer yours. I pick on James because I see him right in front of me. James, who's at Moody Bible Institute, that life isn't his. His calling to work in the marketplace, that life and that calling isn't his. It's a calling that God says, that God, what do you want me to do? I graduated from a seminary, but Lord, what is it that you want me to do? His life is coming before the Lord with the open hand and say, Lord, my life is yours. I give it to you. But that decision has to come early on, doesn't it? Again, going back to Indonesia, I get a chance. One of these 24-year-old individuals, I had a chance to sit down and talk with them. I had a mentor who sat with them. He had started and he had invested $10,000, and he got an investment $10,000 to work on a startup. Well, that startup grew that he sold his business for $132 million. But one of the things that we talked to him about before he did this startup, and I said, so-and-so, whose life does it belong to? Whose life do you belong to? Because if that life is the Lord's, then you got to make a decision right now what you're going to do with that money before your company goes really successful and you make a tons of money. Because when you make that decision, once you become rich, you won't make that decision. You're going to have to make that decision early on, before you become wealthy, before you get that job, before. Whose life do you belong to? Because when we're right in that mist, it's not going to be very good. And we're going to make decisions that benefit us. I share this with you because for many of us, money is a huge issue, isn't it? We worry about money. We like that life. My wife and I, early on, when we first started Resource Global, we had no money. I still remember the early days of Resource Global when we first started 12 years ago. I sat there, I had maxed out my credit cards, not very good at the first startup. I had my last amount of $200 left to get a hotel, to meet with the donor, all of those different things. But my wife and I said is, can we live on one salary? And can we always use that rest of the salary that we have to glorify the Lord in everything that we do? To continue to support it for ministry initiatives because, Lord, that money is not ours. We're a steward of the money and the time and gifts that He has given us. Fast forward 12 years later, I've gotten doing pretty well financially. This organization has grown to a point where it was zero, and now it's about $1 million, $1.5 million. Things are going well. My wife is doing well at work as a teacher. Her salary continues to increase. Does our giving change? The answer is no. We're still committed doing the same thing. And I'm not standing here bragging about it. It's a commitment that we had to make. It's a commitment that all of us have to make in our lives. Whose life do we belong to? And if our life belongs to the Lord, and if the Lord calls us that it's about others first and never ours, then it makes it easy. That the Lord's anointed, as David talks about, is concerned about upholding the glory of God and honoring the God, that I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied, and Lord, you are calling me to do this. So the answer makes it easy. That the money that I have is not mine, but rather it's yours. And so when Mark and the church is so gracious to give me an honorarium every single time I speak, the answer is simple. Mark, you use it back for your church because this money is not mine. I do it out of humbleness because of what you have provided for me in the cross. This person needs help? Great. This money isn't mine, Lord. And the Lord blesses me, probably not in financial ways, but in ways that I can't even imagine. Whose life do you belong to? The Lord